everyone! Welcome back to my little corner of the internet. My name is Evian and the twirling power is strong with this one. Now, if that intro already didn't give it away, we are sewing skirts in this one. Twirly, flowy, fantastic skirts. And I am looking so much forward to showing you. We will also be sewing a vest and an apron. And we'll also be playing a bit with embroidery and sculpting and resin casting in this one. It's gonna be a fun one. So this is part 4 in a series I have of making a Marisa cosplay from Toho. In the last one we made her hat and styled her wig. And if you wish to follow along from the beginning, I have all the videos linked down below in the description. For now, I think that was everything I wanted to say, so let's just get to the good part. It always begins with some sort of a pattern. For Marisa's skirt, I wanted something flowy, but I felt like a full circle skirt would be too much. So I settled on a 3/4 circle skirt and drafted it out myself to fit my needs. The next steps are rather self-explanatory, as I just followed the pattern and cut out my fabric. Black for the actual skirt, and white for the lining that the ruffle would eventually be attached to. The thing about circle skirts, or any skirt pieces cut on a bias, is that they will warp slightly because of, well, gravity. So I hung the pieces up for a few days to let gravity do its thing before I evened out the hem. The fabric frayed quite a lot, so I overlocked the edges of all the fabric pieces before sewing them together. I began with the lining, sewed up the sides and left the gap towards the top for the zipper. I didn't film it this time, but I always press all my seams. For the ruffle, I wanted some visual interest, so I decided to use this eyelet lace fabric. It was cut into strips and sewn into one long length of fabric. The seams were neatly finished before the whole thing was hemmed. I used the same method of gathering the fabric as I've done previously. I evenly pinned the fabric along the lining's edge and gathered it all up until it matched up nicely with the hem. And let me tell you, this was strangely therapeutic and satisfying to do. Next step was to sew it in place, and I used my overlock to finish the edge. To give the skirt some extra body and flow, I decided to use horsehair braid in the hem. The way I attached it to the lining layer was probably not the correct way, but it worked out. It was sewn in place, and this seam also helped to flatten out the hem of the skirt and keep it nice and crisp. The black layer was sewn up the same way as the white one, minus the ruffles, and I sewed in the zipper. For this layer I attached the horsehair braid the correct way, by sewing it to the right side of the fabric first, before folding it to the inside and securing it with a top stitch. I already knew at this point that I needed to be able to attach a pouch and some potion bottles to the skirt, so I used some fake leather and hardware to make some cool looking straps for the waistband. The waistband got some interfacing and was sewn by machine to the front before folded over and sewn by hand on the inside. At some point, I decided I didn't like how overly complicated I had made the leather straps attached to the skirt, so I undid a bit of the waistband and redid them. Much better. I also made part of the waistband elastic to accommodate for my fluctuating size. The very last step was to attach some hooks and eyes, as well as some gorgeous buttons I found in my stash. The skirt was done, and just look at her go! Gotta love a good twirl! I ran into a problem with Marisa's vest pretty fast. It needed big golden buttons, and I couldn't find a single one that I liked. So, I decided to use this as an opportunity to practice my sculpting and casting skills. I used a wooden coin as the base for the master button to make sure it would be completely round. And for the sculpting itself, I used a 2-part epoxy clay, which I probably should have used gloves for. It was a bit more of a hassle to work with than I had expected, but after some trial and error, it did the trick. Once it was all dry and set, it was sanded to take away fingerprints and spots that was too uneven. I used a 2-part silicone putty to make a mold for the buttons. Probably should have used gloves for this too. And since I needed these buttons to be functional, I also sculpted a thick loop for them. The loop was cast in resin first and sanded smooth, before it was held up by toothpicks on the button mold so I could cast it directly into the button. There were a few scuffs and marks on the final button since the mold wasn't perfect, but you know, neither am I. So I can live with that. The buttons were sanded to smooth out the edges, then they were primed and sprayed with a base coat of red. I learned somewhere that using a red base coat for gold items would make the gold really pop, and it actually looks like it made a difference. I just used acrylic paints to weather and highlight them. Now for the vest itself, I went back to commercial patterns again. Sometimes it's really difficult to find that one perfect pattern for a cosplay, so learning how to modify basic patterns is such an incredibly useful skill to have. For this one, I started by picking out exactly what pieces I would need from the main pattern, cut them out, and then shorten them a lot for Marisa's crop style vest. I also extended the front so it would overlap a lot more and have room for the 4 buttons I wanted in the front. I made a few mock-ups of the vest, and I was happy with it on the 3rd try. I also tried it on with the blouse underneath to see if it would fit right with the color of the blouse. The buttonholes had to be very large to accommodate for the giant buttons, so I figured it was a good idea to learn how to make bound buttonholes. What you see now was my first try, and I decided it was good enough to move on to the actual vest. I marked the placement of all the buttonholes with thread, so I wouldn't leave hard to remove marks on the front of the fabric, and began the tedious task of making the buttonholes. Once they were all done, I basted all the buttonholes shut so they wouldn't stretch or deform while I worked on the rest of the vest. Both layers of the collar was interfaced and sewn together. All curves were notched before it was turned right side out. And once again, I cannot stress enough just how important a good press is. I mean, look at that difference! With the collar prepared, I could finally start sewing the vest together. And once that was done, the collar was basted in place. To give the vest a bit of body and stiffness along the collar and front, I drafted a facing layer that was interfaced. This was attached right sides together, all along the raw edge of the front, with the collar sandwiched between the facing and the actual vest. After sewing the seam and another good press, this left me with a pretty nice finish of the edges. Now, this part can be a bit confusing, so bear with me. To make sure the holes for the arms would look as neatly finished as possible, I sewed in the lining in 2 parts. The lining was sewn right sides together by the armholes, turned inside out and pressed in place. This ensured that I could give the lining a good understitch to keep it in place too. And finally, I sewed up the back seam of the lining. It was a bit finicky, but it worked. And this might seem like a very convoluted and weird way of doing it, but I'm self-taught when it comes to sewing, and this really seemed like the easiest and most clean way of doing it at the time. The rest of the lining was attached to the inside by hand. I did this with a visible running stitch simply because I like the look. Then the final step was to attach the buttons and a few tiny snap buttons to keep the overlap of the vest properly in place. The last thing to make for now was the apron. I chose to mostly wait with this one until the skirt was done so I could compare the dimensions between the skirt and apron while making it. The only thing I did on the apron before making the skirt was the embroidery. But Evian, I hear you say, Marisa doesn't have any embroidery on her apron. And no, she doesn't. But I really wanted to do some embroidery, so I decided that my version of Marisa has embroidery on her apron. Isn't cosplay great? I made a design that simply featured Marisa's name in kanji, and I added some stars to keep that particular theme running through the entire cosplay. I printed it out in a few different sizes to see what I liked before I ironed on interfacing on the fabric and started tracing the pattern with a friction pen. As I was tracing, I made sure to add the direction of the stitches too, to not lose my way while I was working on the actual embroidery. I also did a few tests of different thread thicknesses, and once I decided what looked best, I got to it. Embroidery is something I really enjoy doing, but I still haven't done a lot of it. This became pretty evident on the first kanji, but already by the second kanji it was clear that my stitch quality had improved. And for a few weeks, this is what I did every day, and I enjoyed the heck out of it. I am still proud of the final result, and it might be my favorite detail of the cosplay. The ruffle was also prepared early on with a very narrow hem that was hand sewn in place. This was the point where I went back to working on the skirts, and the apron was put on hold until this particular day. I have been spending the morning preparing the pieces for the apron. So I have prepared the actual pattern for the apron. I have cut down the rounded corners like I want. I have prepared the right size for the ruffle and the lace that's going in with it, because I'm actually not gonna sew at home tonight. I am going to a friend where we're gonna have a sewing night, and I have never had that before. I have never done social sewing, so I'm actually really excited about this. So I'm gonna bring the apron pieces to work on those, and I'm excited. I might not do a lot of filming of the progress of this since, as I said, I'm gonna be at someone's place, but we'll see. Needless to say, this was a really good evening, full of laughter. I worked on my apron, the friend I was visiting was working on sewing curtains for her living room, and we both collectively taught our friend how to hem pants. I sewed up most of the apron this evening, which was simply to sandwich the ruffle between two layers of fabric and turn it right side out. The day after, I realized that the fabric felt a bit too soft than what I would like, so I ironed on interfacing on the entire apron by slipping the interfacing in between two layers. I gathered down the top edge of the apron to the desired width and attached the waistband. To simulate how Marisa's apron is pulled back and tied into a bow, I sewed in a fold in the waistband. I did also sew a small piece of Velcro to the back of the waistband to prepare for when I made the bow at a later time. The very last step was to attach hook and eyes and a couple of push buttons to keep it all in place, and the apron was done. All that was left now was to frolic in my new threads. I'm not gonna lie, I really like how this turned out, and it's so much fun to see it all coming together. With our main outfit done, all we need to do now is to add accessories and details to really make this sassy witch come alive. And that's exactly what we're gonna do in the next video. And who knows, I might even show you the making of a very special prop that every witch needs. So stick around if you want to see that. But for now, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!